Hi, I thought I should, welcome to ADM320. We're in workshop 1. I thought I should create a video on cross-tabulation. It's helpful. Even after using the book and looking through the PowerPoint, you may find that you need to actually see an example or two, and I have two created here that we're going to do in the video. I've also given you the Excel file, so I highly recommend that you actually have opened the Excel file and you do the steps as you see them in the video. Pause as needed so that you can catch up and so that you're actually creating at the same time that you're seeing it created on the screen. The first example we're going to do is actually from the book directly. You'll find it's actually in Chapter 2, Problem 34, Part A. It uses the mutual funds data, which I created a spreadsheet. As you can see here, it has one worksheet. The worksheet is data mutual funds example. There's a second worksheet for the second example called Super Bowl data, which I thought would be kind of cool. So obviously we're going to use the data mutual funds first, and we're going to follow exactly what Part A asked us to do so they can get familiar with the wording that you're seeing in your problem for your homework. Here it says to prepare a cross-tabulation of the data on fund type in your rows and average annual return over the past 5 years in columns. Now, if you look at the data, you'll see that the first row has the headings. That's very important when you're doing cross-tabulation, that you know what is the heading or the title to each of the columns of data. That's going to help you when you actually pick your field list and decide what goes in rows and what goes in columns. If your data doesn't have that, I would highly recommend you insert a row and actually type in those titles if you're going to be doing a pivot table. It actually is helpful for any time to always have titles on your data. So we're going to be using Excel 2010, but you'll find that 2007 is very similar. In fact, I've been using 2007 for a long time. I think it was just last year that I went to 2010. Read the problem. So obviously we've done that already. Make sure you understand what goes in the rows, what goes in the columns. And then when it says use classes of certain segments, that's actually going to be the last step that we touch. First, we want to get the correct data in the rows and the columns. So the first step, I find the easiest, is to actually highlight your data. So put your cursor on the A1, hold down the tab on your mouse, and highlight all the data. That's going to make it tons easier when we go to do the pivot table. Once you have the data highlighted, you're going to go up to the insert feature you see up on the ribbon. When you hit insert, you'll see tons of options, including graphs that you might have already touched already, and etc. But on the left-hand side, you'll see pivot table. We're going to pick that option, and we want a pivot table, not a pivot chart. So I'm going to pick pivot table. When you do that, the first thing it's going to do is do a pop-up window. And the pop-up window is going to need two things to get started. It wants to know where the data is at. And since we had already highlighted it prior to picking the insert pivot table option, you'll notice it already says it knows exactly what worksheet and what cell references it's going to grab. It's going to grab from the data mutual funds example, from A1, which is right here, all the way down to F46, which is at the bottom there. And that's what we had highlighted. So make sure that you've actually picked all the data and you didn't miss a row or a column. That's going to make it tough, and you'll have different results. Once you do that, the second option you need to know is where you're going to put it. Now, we need to have all our work in the same worksheet. Remember, for a problem, all the work and the answers are in the same worksheet. So we want to pick existing worksheet, and we want to tell it where to put it. Now, I'm not going to get real fancy, but obviously right below Part A would be a great place. That way I've labeled my answer. This is Part A. I've actually written out the question. You don't need to do that, but if you want to, because it helps you see what you're trying to do, that's great. But obviously we want to label the answer very near where it says Part A. Once you've picked the spot, which we're going to pick H4 here, and you can see that where it says Data Mutual Funds Example, the worksheet, and H4, then we're going to hit the word Enter. When we hit Enter, you'll see that it puts it in there for us. Once the data has been selected and where do you want it located, you're going to pick the OK. Once you pick OK and a pivot table option, it gives you this new window on the right-hand side. And you'll see here that all the different column names have been listed as fields that we can add to our pivot table report. Down here at the bottom, you'll see we can pick what goes in the row, what picks in the column, and how we want to play with the values in the columns. Do we want to sum them? Do we want to count them? Do we only want the max? There's plenty of options there. We're just going to start basic right here and get the fund types in the rows. The easiest way is to drag it into its spot. So since this is what I want as fund type, I'm going to drag it down into the row label area and release. When it does, you'll notice right away, it told me here's the row labels. There was only 3 types to group under, fund types, DEs, FIs, and IEs. Once you get the rows in, I usually do the columns second. If you notice, we're doing the 5-year annual return. So we want to pick the 5-year annual return, and we want to drag and drop it into columns. Now you'll see that we have the row labels and the column labels. So the only thing left is to actually get the data here. And to do that, we need to put it into this column. And remember, since this is our 5-year annuals, we're going to actually drag that and also put that under the values rectangle. So then it knows what values to put there. Now it will always default to a sum. So you'll see here it says, oh, you've asked me to do a sum of the 5-year annual returns by the different fund types. But if you remember, the problem doesn't really make a lot of sense by doing a sum. We actually want to know how many had that 5-year annual return. So we need to do a count there, not a sum. And most pivot tables, count makes more sense than sum. So you have to really think about what your column data is. You'll find it's very rare that sum is as important as how many. So to change that, you'll see that we have this little drop-down arrow. And if we pick the drop-down arrow and we pick value field settings, we have the ability to change that summarization to anything here in the option table. So you see it opened a window for the value field settings. It's defaulted to sum because that's the first one, but we can pick count here. You also see other options: average, maxes, mins, products of things, counts of numbers, standard deviations, standard deviation of the population, because that's 2 different formulas, variances, and etc. But we're going to pick count because that's what we need to do. We want to know how many of these funds had these types of annual return from our data set. So we're going to pick an OK once we pick count. And you'll see it made a change over here in the box. Instead of doing a sum, it's now doing a count. And of course, it's plainly shown in our pivot table. So now the field list window we're done with. We have the rows we want, we have the columns we want, and we've done a count of those columns. So at this time, I'm going to close that window because we only have one thing left to do. But let's look at our data. You'll see in the pivot table here that it indeed has grouped what we wanted, but the problem is every single 5-year return has gotten its own column, and we want to group them. It makes more sense on a pivot table many times to group things because you're trying to see how many were within that range. And the problem actually said use classes of 0 to 9.99, 10 to 19.99, etc. for that 5-year annual return. So we need to change this using what they call a group option. To group, it's very simple. You want to click on the first column like I did. This happens to have the value of 2.37 in the column area. You're going to do a right click and you're going to see an option called group. Select that option and you'll see that it says, oh, you want me to do individuals. And it goes, the lowest number it's telling you is 2.37 up to 51.1. But you'll notice that we actually need to go by 9.99, sorry. When I do that and I hit OK, it's going to say, actually, I want to change it and see if I can get this to go to 0. Sometimes that won't work, so let's just try it. And 59. So we're going to actually put in what it said. It went from 0 to 59.99. 0, go to 59.9, and go by 9.9. Then we'll hit OK. And you'll see how it grouped. It grouped the first one exactly what we wanted, 0 up to 9.99. The second one, and here's the problem with data that has decimals and not whole numbers, it started at 9.99 and went up to 1998. So one of the hard problems is whenever you're grouping on decimal numbers, the data is actually decimals, it's not all whole numbers, it's not going to exactly do what you want. It's going to appear like it has overlap, but in fact it's really above 9.99 that's in the second column to 1998. So that's what happens when you have decimals. And that's how you create a cross-tabulation. Now, once again, pause, go back through, make sure you understand this example before we move on to the second example. The second example has whole numbers in it, and I wanted to show that so you can see that it will actually do exactly what you want when there's whole numbers. You can see here we have the Super Bowl data. We happen to have the Super Bowl number, the year it happened in, what state it was held in, winning teams, losing teams, the points for each, and the winning margin. How many points did they win by? So in this example, I created this up on my own, but create a cross tabulation with state in the rows and winning margin by group. And here, all the winning margins, as you can see, are whole numbers. And we want the winning margin by group to go from 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, etc. So how do we do that? Well, remember, the first step is you want to highlight your data. So I'm going to highlight the data. I don't know what Super Bowl this is up to, but it looks like it only went up to Super Bowl 44, so this data is some years old. Once it's been highlighted, all the data, including the names, we're going to hit Insert. We're going to hit Table, Pivot Table. And again, since I've already highlighted the data, it already knows that we want from this worksheet, which is the worksheet we're in, Super Bowl data set example, and it wants to go from, it says C1. So you can see I didn't actually go all the way back to A. So I obviously am missing some data on the left-hand side, so I want to fix that. So how do I fix that? You can cancel, and you can just go back to the left and highlight the whole thing, which I'm doing here. Or you could actually just change that C to an A. So let's get a pivot table, and now let's look at it again. Super Bowl data set example, going from A1, that makes sense, to H44. Now I have to tell it where I want it to go. I'm going to put it in the existing worksheet. I'm going to click this right-hand side icon so I can select where in the worksheet I want to be, and I'm going to select right there. Once it's shown where you want to create it at, you're going to hit Enter. Now it has all the data it needs to give us the field list window. So double check, make sure both these are what you want, hit OK. The field list window is very important because that's what we pick the rows and the columns and how we want to do the summations. Whether we do a sum or a count. If you remember in the original problem, which we can just move over to the right to read it, we want state in the rows. So I'm going to grab state and put it in the rows. It wants to see winning margin in the columns. So let me get that back. If you lose your window for your pivot, just click back on row labels, it'll come back up. So I want winning margin in the columns. And now I need to sum on winning margin in the summation of values. But once again, sum doesn't make any sense. I don't want to add up the total number of points. I want to do a count. So we're going to click, change the value field settings to a count, and hit OK. And now we can see that we have a count of the winning margins. We can see exactly how many among all the states that they were held in. Because remember, a lot of times the Super Bowl is only held in areas that are nice weather or closed domes, so it's very limited. So you can see this number of states it's happened in. We can even see totals. You can see 2 were held in Arizona, 11 in California, et cetera, et cetera. We can also see how many had winning margins of 32. There's only 1. But that's not very interesting. You remember in the problem, they wanted us to group. So instead of having all these singular ones, we're going to group. Easiest way to group, click on the first column in your pivot table that has data in it. This is the 1 point winning margin. There's only 1. That's interesting. We're going to right click and pick a group option. And here now we have to emulate exactly what they want. They want to go from 0 to the max, and they want to do it by 5s. Hit OK. If you're not sure, just try something and see what it looks like. It's easy to pick. So we'll hit OK. And we'll see that went from 0 to 4. So it's not exactly what we wanted. So going by 5s did not work. So we're just going to right click again. We're going to go back to group and we're going to fix that. By 6s. And you can see now it's emulated what we wanted. Yes, it has, but I had an error on what I wrote. I actually should have wrote that it's going from 6 to 11 because I'm doing this by 6s because 0 margin would make sense. But actually I can change that. Let's try that. Let's do a grouping and start at 1 because you wouldn't really have a winning margin. of 0. So I probably should have changed that. I think it's supposed to be 1 to 5. There we go. Now I have it right. So this actually I'm going to change so that we have the correct thing. And yours already has that corrected, but mine did not. So now, because you wouldn't have a winning margin of 0, so that was a typo on my part. So now I can see exactly how many had winning margins in the 1 to 5 range, which was 11, 6 to 10, and I can actually see totals by state as well, which is what's so nice about a pivot table is you can take large values of data. We had like 43 rows of data here, and you can summarize it. And that's something you want to learn and want to understand because a lot of times you'll be handed data and you'll like not really sure what's going on until you do some summarization. That's part of the descriptive statistics function that we are doing here early in ADM320. So I hope this has helped you. Once again, if I went a little fast, that's the nice thing about video is you can pause it and you can catch up and you can replay it. Please do so you understand both these examples, and then you're probably ready to tackle the homework problem, which has three pivot tables in it. Please give me feedback on whether this video was helpful to you, because obviously I want to create more of them if students are finding them useful. Have fun with your pivot tables.